Hey guys, this video is for APUS for the juniors. I noticed that a lot of you guys have not watched the video yet that I left yesterday, House of Cards Falls. So please do that if you haven't watched that video before you watch this video. And I'm gonna put a reminder on Google Classroom later, just to remind you guys in case you forgot that we have to watch these videos like in asynchronous periods. That means that you go on YouTube and you watch some of these captivating videos. um okay, so we were talking about the Great Depression in the last video, so again, really important to go back and watch it if you haven't. Which was absolutely devastating, right? The American economy was brought to its knees, and the thing is that President Hoover was in office, and it was up to him to try to respond to the Great Depression in some way, some shape or form. And the thing is that on one hand, it seemed like Herbert Hoover would have been the perfect person to deal with an emergency like this. The great humanitarian, they called him, the man who helped feed hungry people in Europe during World War One, the man who was the food administrator, a man who was seen as like the most competent administrator ever in the eyes of a lot of people, a man who could get things done, multimillionaire by the time he was 40, then decided to commit his life to humanitarian work and making the bureaucracy work for people. So you couldn't think, at least on paper, somebody who could be better prepared to actually deal with the Great Depression. But as we talked about in live class and in our video yesterday, the reason why it didn't turn out that well is because Herbert Hoover, despite all those gifts that he had, right? He was a capable manager, someone who really did care about people, at least in the abstract. But he was limited by his own personal beliefs. Although he wasn't as conservative as Herbert Hoover, as conservative as Calvin Coolidge and people like that, he was definitely on the more progressive end of the Republican Party. He still was limited by very old-fashioned beliefs about rugged individuals, about the size of government, about this resistance to having government mandate things on people. Remember when he ran the food administration, it was just like suggestions, right? He relied on voluntary effort for the meatless Mondays and the wheatless Wednesdays and all of that. And perhaps his biggest failing was, he had a deep-seated opposition to direct government assistance to people. He did not believe that it was the government's job to help people who, might be suffering economically. And that belief really proved to be his undoing, and not just his undoing, but the undoing really of our country for the years of Herbert Hoover's presidency. This country was really on its knees. And that is no exaggeration. We were in as bad a position as we ever have been before or since, even though this year comes close. And yet the presidential leadership was rudderless, and really doing next to nothing to really help the people who are suffering because of the Great Depression. Mr. Urato always disagrees with me. He always says, well, Herbert Hoover actually did do things to try to help people during the Depression. But I don't agree with that. And I've studied this quite a bit. Herbert Hoover did more than most Republicans probably would have done, but it was still woefully inadequate to the scale of the emergency. All right, so let's start digging into this. Now, as humanitarian engineer, the slash engineer, or maybe engineer slash humanitarian, the man who got things done, it seemed like he would be the guy to do it. But he basically to handle this emergency. But he basically said any welfare programs destroy a person's sense of self. That as does hunger, right? But the idea that, like people can't start getting dependent on the government. Because if they do that, then, they lose a sense of pride in themselves. They lose their work ethic. They become lazy, unmotivated, all those arguments. So Hoover did not believe the government should be directly assisting people who were victims of the Great Depression. And the thing is that character would be undermined, he said. Like, you're not going to be as strong of a person if the government just comes and helps you. Now, part of Hoover's strategy was to make absurdly optimistic statements about the state of the economy. Now, part of a president's job or a leader's job is to kind of instill hope in people, but there's hope and then there's delusion, right? And some of his statements were veering into the delusional. He said prosperity is just around the corner. That's what I'm going to title this video, actually. And he was saying that in 1930, while the Great Depression was had been raging in the country for almost a year. And always tried to pump things up and say things aren't as bad as you might think. Um, which people could clearly see was not true, right? Things were getting worse and worse as the years went on. In addition to these absurdly optimistic statements, these delusional statements, he also made very insensitive comments. Like one of the thing that people did to try to make a living, and some of the pictures I'm going to show you on Thursday, I'll show you images of this. But one of the ways that people tried to make money during the Great Depression was to just sell apples on the street for a nickel. So often people who had once had decent jobs, who were able to support themselves, were kind of reduced to the situation where they were, just selling apples on the street. And when he was asked about that, Hoover, if things really aren't so bad, why are people selling apples on the street? And Hoover said, well, maybe they like selling apples. Maybe that's a career choice that they made, which is bizarre, right? Saying something like that. It reminds me of Ivanka Trump this year when she suggested that people should just try something new if they don't have a job anymore because of the virus. So it's beyond insensitive, right? It veers into cruelty, right? To actually say things like that. Hoover approved a program to provide food for livestock, for cows and pigs, and maybe chickens too, but he adamantly opposed any sort of direct relief or food assistance to hungry people. So just imagine that, right? You know, when that got out, right? Like what is he thinking? And in addition to these statements that Hoover's making, he also made some very poor decisions, policy decisions during his presidency. One, he ordered a series of tax increases in 1931. Now, usually you think, well, Republicans are for tax cuts, so he's for tax increases, so he's taking a liberal position. But increasing taxes is one of the most foolish things you can do during an economic emergency, right? Because you want more money in the economy. If you raise taxes, you're taking money out of the economy. So that was a very foolish decision. But probably the most foolish decision that Hoover made was he signed the Hawley-Smoot Tariff in 1930. Now, remember when we talked about the causes of the Great Depression? High tariffs were one of the causes of the Great Depression, right? It worsened the depression in Europe because they were unable to sell their goods to the United States because of the high tariffs that we placed on foreign goods. So they weren't able to make any money, and this was really a worldwide depression, right? The world was linked together now more than ever. It's the 20th century, and economic problems in Europe will eventually come back to affect us. American companies weren't able to sell goods to Europe because they put high tariffs on us because we put high tariffs on them. So tariffs are one of the causes of the Great Depression. Yet Herbert Hoover signed the Hawley-Smoot Tariff, which increased tariff rates to the highest they had ever been in American history, a 48% rate, which basically paralyzed American trade. And made it impossible for American companies to sell any excess goods to Europe, and also worsening the depression in Europe. So this was seen as one of the most disastrous moves that was ever made by the United States government in response to an emergency. That's why after the Second World War, there was generally a consensus about the issue of free trade, that generally we should go in the direction of reducing tariffs because high tariffs were rightly seen as one of the causes of the Great Depression to begin with. And he just made things worse by signing an even higher tariff, thinking that would protect American industry, but hardly. Midway through his term, Hoover somewhat reversed course. He did, I guess this is to his credit, he decided that, what he was doing or not doing wasn't working. So he decided to actually shift strategies and decide to start, doing other things. He began saying, well, the government does, or at least implementing policies where the government would have a larger role in dealing with the worst effects of the depression. But the things that he did still generally reflected his conservative trickle down beliefs. Um, like, for instance, well, one thing he did do that was good, he was the first president to actually implement a public works program where the government would actually put people to work to try to build important projects. So people were put to work, in the Hoover administration by some of these programs they implemented, even though FDR had certainly increased that exponentially. Right, because what Hoover did do in the area of public works was still very limited, and certainly was not enough to actually put millions and millions of people to work who didn't have jobs because of the Depression, in the way that Franklin Roosevelt did when he became president. Hoover's signature initiative to deal with the Great Depression was in 1932. He had Congress pass a new agency called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, or the RFC. Now, what the RFC did was it lent money to big businesses. It lent money to banks. It lent money to insurance companies. It lent money to railroads, with the thinking that with all this new money, they would put people to work. But again, that still reflects trickle down thinking. And also, it was seen as a giveaway to the wealthy, right? Hoover is adamantly opposed to any government assistance to the poor and to the hungry, but he's giving money or lending money to big business. So the one big thing that Hoover's doing was just basically seen as a giveaway to the wealthy. So in many ways, it made Hoover's political situation even worse, establishing this program, even though the program was a relative success. In fact, FDR kept the RFC even when he became president. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation actually remained a government agency until the 1950s. So it was a success, and it was expanded on by FDR, but it certainly wasn't doing enough. Now, despite his incredible reluctance to actually do anything to actually help people who were victims of the Great Depression, Hoover still was the first president ever to actually intervene in a time of economic emergency. No president had ever done that before, right? Every time there was a depression, the president just said, well, just let's ride it out and things will get better. It's just the natural business cycle, booms and busts. So no president had ever intervened at all. So even Hoover's limited efforts to try to deal with the Depression was more than any other president had done in an economic emergency. Even though this economic emergency was more serious than any other we ever suffered. Even those bad panics in the 1800s. So I really think the metaphor, or the expression that would be the most appropriate to describe Hoover's policies was too little, too late. He acted way too slowly to actually do anything. And when he did finally do something, the programs were insufficient to actually deal with the scale of the emergency. And Hoover's name just, well, also there were, some other things. Hoover was really still a believer in a balanced budget. He still had this old-fashioned belief that even though we're in an economic emergency, the government should not really be spending more than it's taking in, even though it usually did when Hoover was president. That's why he ordered those substantial tax increases to begin with. He did support the Norris-LaGuardia Act, which actually recognized the rights of unions. So that was a fairly progressive piece of legislation. But he insisted on keeping the gold standard, which contracted the currency, right? One of FDR's first moves as president was to take the United States off the gold standard because there's only so much gold. So if the money is backed up by gold, that's going to mean there's a limited amount of money. So that was another mistake, that Hoover made. And Hoover's name just became, I think, Judy Shelton, who Trump just nominated the Federal Reserve, and the Republicans are trying to get her onto the Federal Reserve Board, actually spent most of her career as a supporter of the gold standard, of actually bringing back the gold standard, which is not a good idea. I think most economists would agree with that. Now, Hoover's name just became synonymous with suffering. Um, People who were homeless often set up shanties in public areas, in parks and the like. Central Park was actually full of shanties that were actually built by homeless people. And they called these shanties Hoovervilles. Um, after the president, who's seen as heartless. People used to empty their pocket. Like when you pull your pocket out. I don't know if you can see this. When you pull your pocket out like that, right? That usually means you're broke, right? You have no money. People used to do that and start waving it around and say, "Oh, a Hoover flag, a symbol of me being broke." People began eating rats and squirrels and animals that they just could find running around. They called them Hoover hogs. Homeless people covered themselves up with newspapers as blankets, which they called Hoover blankets. So his name just became synonymous with suffering. If anybody, I'm actually going to play you this song in our live class on Thursday, but it's a song from Little Orphan Annie. Which takes place during the Great Depression. We'd like to thank you, Herbert Hoover, for really showing us the way, basically saying that, laying at his feet responsibility for the Great Depression. Hoover did not cause the Great Depression. Remember, the causes of the Great Depression are complex and they've been brewing for years. But Hoover does deserve much of the blame for responding inadequately and incompetently to this horrible, horrible economic emergency. Um, the thing which really doomed Herbert Hoover in the eyes of most Americans, if that hadn't happened already by 1932, but was by the way he handled the bonus army situation that year. Let's talk a little bit about that. This is probably the most infamous episode of the entire Hoover presidency. Now, back in 1924, Congress had passed a bill giving World War I veterans a bonus, but they would have to wait 20 years for it. So they have to wait until 1945 to actually get the bonus. But this was 1932. A lot of World War I vets were unemployed and desperate, and they wanted Congress to actually to give them the bonus early. So it was only 8 years in. They didn't want to wait the full 20 years. So they said, pay us the bonus now because we need the money. And thousands of unemployed veterans marched on Washington demanding an early payment of their bonus, and they called themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Force because the American Army during World War I was called the American Expeditionary Force, Pershing's army, and they set up camp. These thousands of unemployed veterans in the Anacostia area of Washington, D.C. That's kind of a rough area on the banks of the Potomac River, and they set up camp there. Until Congress actually voted on whether to pay him the bonus early. Congress voted down an early payment of the bonus. Most went home, but there were some veterans who lingered there because a lot of them had nowhere to go. There really was no home. So they just were kind of stayed in these camps. And Herbert Hoover thought that this was chaotic and this was an eyesore to actually have, all these, unemployed veterans just, basically loitering in the nation's capital. So Herbert Hoover ordered the U.S. Army in to basically clear out the encampment. And he was very vague on how they should do that. And the man who was in charge of the mission was Douglas MacArthur. Douglas MacArthur is the legendary, even though he wasn't legendary yet, he became legendary during the Second World War, but who became this legendary World War II general. But he was very aggressive and hot-headed. And the thing is that he was in charge of this mission that Hoover had actually gave him to actually clear out the remaining camps. And MacArthur decided to go in full force. He used bayonets and tear gas to disperse the crowd, to actually get rid of all those lingering veterans who were still loitering on the banks of the Potomac River. It was an ugly scene that was covered by newspapers. A baby died from being gassed. The whole thing was absolutely terrible. And then when they were cleared out because of the gas, then MacArthur's army just burnt down the shanties where they had been staying. And this got massive coverage, the gassing and the burning of the shanties. So it was basically the army going after the army, right? Because these guys had been World War I veterans that served their country and now were hurting, and this is the way the army is dealing with them. So it was a shocking incident, and it just reinforced this whole idea of Herbert Hoover as being heartless and cruel. in the way that he was dealing with people who were victims of the Great Depression. And the Democrats, as a result, sensed victory in that year's election because Franklin Roosevelt, who was the front runner for the 1932 Democratic nomination, actually, when seeing those pictures of what happened to the bonus army, said, "I've just been elected president." Just from that scene alone. But that scene was just a metaphor for the way a lot of people felt that Herbert Hoover had been responding to the Depression all along. All right, guys, very good. So, or not very good. This is some bad, really heavy stuff we were talking about. All right, so on Thursday, if I forget, someone please remind me. I have a whole bunch of images I want to show you of the Great Depression, and the way people were living during those horrible years. And also, I'll play you the song from Annie about Herbert Hoover, and then we're going to start talking about the 1932 election, where Franklin Roosevelt emerges as the Democratic nominee, offering a new deal for the American people. All right, guys, I'll see you on Thursday. Peace.